I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. I've worked on energy issues for about 30 years in both government and in the private sector. And there are ways that we can ensure a reliable, affordable, safe, secure, and environmentally benign energy future. And I commend the committee and also the group of 10, now the group of 16, for putting this session together to discuss a bipartisan way of approaching this issue. Let me begin with an orientation and some of the basic facts. As the solutions and options we discussed this morning, they need to be put in the context of today's market reality. And those realities talk about higher prices, uneven and increasing demand, limited excess capacity, heightened geopolitical and investment risk, and increased concern over climate change and the environment. I would argue that to complicate matters further, as though we needed that, we are simultaneously facing these challenges against a backdrop of a changing global landscape. And it's one characterized by emerging new players with new agendas, new leverage, different business practices. We're doing it against outmoded institutions which may not be up to the task. So we need to consider that as well. We're looking at a series of new alignments in this new landscape, new alignments, new rules. And so we need new policies. The energy system we have today is truly global, and it is immense. It's enormous. The projections are that will only grow larger as a function of population, GDP growth, and increased standards of living going forward. Today, energy demand is projected to rise by over 50% between now and 2030, and the bulk of that will be in the developing and emerging economies, not the OECD. The landscape is changing. Some 85% of our energy demand globally is met with fossil fuels, and while oil accounts for the majority of fuel use in the OECD, coal is the king in the non-OECD, where fossil fuels make up over 90% of total energy consumption. So overlaying a carbon constraint on an 85% fossil fuel dependent world is an enormous task. Reducing that figure to 75% is a huge lift. Eliminating those fuels anytime soon, I would argue, is impossible, as we currently have nothing to replace them at scale. So as previously stated, it's a huge challenge, but it's also a unique opportunity for the United States to lead in this role. Having said that, given both the forecast for new demand growth and the present trends for investment, access, and climate considerations, and we refer to those as the above-ground risks, it's not the molecules in the ground. The path we're on is clearly unsustainable, so we have to change. The transformation is necessary, and I would argue in many ways it's already underway.
You all keep the
But that transformation is one that will take decades, not months or years, and requires the thoughtful and careful balancing of economic, security, and environmental objectives, and one that in the interim will require the continued use of conventional fuels and infrastructure, as well as the development of new technologies, alternative fuels of all form, conservation, and efficiency. So we need to distinguish between the truly visionary and strategic and the tactical interim steps that will move us from the current system to a more sustainable future. And we need to do this in a bipartisan fashion, so I commend the Senate for taking this hearing. Let me make a final point, and this is on the issue of energy independence. While I understand the political attraction of slogans in this election year and how well this resonates with the American public, energy independence should not be confused with enhancing energy security. There are 190-odd nations around the world, and none of them is energy independent, and that's for good reason. One need only be reminded of our reliance on the global market to replace lost production in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and that was refined products, not crude oil. Further, as national policy, such independence is in many ways incompatible with our trade agreements, our treaty obligations, and I would argue our foreign policy objectives. We will undoubtedly remain engaged in the Middle East, and we really don't want to cede lower-cost Middle East energy supplies to competitor nations around the world. Having said that, U.S. energy security can and must be enhanced, and we can do this in 5 steps, I would argue. First, by improving efficiency across the board in transport as well as in the industrial, commercial, and residential sectors, by diversifying our fuel choices and fuel suppliers, and this includes the sustaining of domestic production, as has been pointed out. We are the world's 3rd largest oil producer. We really can't afford to lose that position or to let depletion and decline rates in the United States put us in a position of increasing our import dependence, which is currently at about 56%. We need to continue to drill and we need to do so selectively in an environmentally sound manner. We also need to find a way to preserve the role of coal, for it comprises 50% of our electricity. We need to look for more ways to promote domestic gas development, even as we pursue accelerated development of alternative fuels, including nuclear, biofuels, and of course renewables. From a security perspective, it's also worth noting that we have significant resources of non-conventional energy, especially in the Western Hemisphere, and this is oil sands and oil shale. But we need to work on minimizing their carbon footprints if we actually think that this is to be realized. Third, we need a renewed commitment to research and technology, development and deployment, and to expanding and enhancing our infrastructure. This is a capability issue, and it includes human skills as well. So it's education components. Fourth, we need to find more creative and better ways to manage global geopolitics, and I'll be happy to elaborate on that. And if we are truly serious about pursuing climate goals, we need to set an economy-wide price for carbon. I have specific suggestions with respect to many of these issues, but I'll hold those in the interest of time for specific questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Dr. Yergin, go right ahead.
Thank you. It's an honor to be at this Energy Summit, and I'd like to express my appreciation to the leaders, to the chairman and the ranking member of the Energy Committee, to the committee itself, and to the Gang of 10/16 for shaping this summit and bringing us all together. And with this summit, it's certainly expressing the great concern about the need for a comprehensive approach, and I'm pleased to be able to contribute to that discussion. In order to prepare for this, yesterday I read a major article from Time magazine entitled "The Energy Crisis: Time for Action." It detailed the many risks and threats from the current energy course and laid out ideas for the future, and it even used the phrase impending disaster. Of course, the article was from May 7th, 1973, 5 months before the famous October 1973 embargo, more than 35 years ago. In other words, as many of you know, as a nation we have been at work at this for a long time, and as Senator Domenici emphasized, and as this committee knows from its own hard work, actually much has been accomplished as a nation. We're more than twice as energy efficient as we were when that article came out in 1973. And yet also, as this dialogue makes clear, there is much to be done to meet the needs of the American people in terms of energy. So let me address two pieces. One is just to pick up from really where we were last July, just 2 months ago, when it turns out we were at the break point. When we met, oil prices were just about at their peak of $147.27, and now it's just a little over $100. What's happened? Well, I think we have to go to the credit crisis to understand that ever since the credit crisis began last a year ago, July, there's been a big debate as to whether the rest of the world is decoupled from the U.S. economy or not. And that debate has gone back and forth. It's been related to what's happened to the dollar. It's going down, and it's now going up. Well, I think with the sharp price decline that we've seen over the last 2 months, prices are still high, but a decline. The oil market is really conveying the notion and voting against the idea that Europe and Japan are decoupled from the U.S. economic downturn. And so instead what's happening, the market now is reflecting a weaker global economy and thus a weaker global oil demand. And I think that's the heart of the change that we've seen. We have entered, I think, that breakpoint scenario, prices at the level what they were in July and where they are now, and the apprehensions and insecurities that go with them have set in a series of motion, a process that's changing the scene. We see in terms of consumers are voting for more efficient cars, they're managing their transportation differently, businesses are making different decisions, and government policies are changing, notably reflected in the fuel efficiency standards, the first ones in 32 years. We see breakpoint in another way. Last year was probably the year of peak demand in terms of U.S. gasoline, and that's going down. Overall oil demand in the United States is down 4%, over 4% this year compared to last year. So I think that's the market. This focus of the summit is on energy policy, and let me try and just distill maybe, seems to me, lessons from 35 years of national experience going back to 1973. And it leads me to talk about the need which is reflected here in the word bipartisan, in the work of the committee, of the Gang of 10 and 16, an ecumenical approach, a balanced, integrated approach. And I think the first point, and I think we're hearing it now, is avoiding either or. As you look at the energy debates in the United States over the last 35 years, there's been an awful lot of either or. But the truth is that we have a $14 trillion economy that runs on 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy every year, and that's a lot of energy. And as we've heard, there's not a single solution to it. There's no magic wand. Renewables are crossing the divide, to use a term we use. They're becoming part of the energy mix. They're going to grow. They're going to become more extensive. But at the same time, as Frank has emphasized, oil and natural gas today are a little over 60% of our total energy consumption. That's not going to go away soon. The second point is one that goes back to something that Senator Bingaman said, the importance of encouraging timely investment, because that's really what gives us our energy future. And we need timely investment across the entire energy spectrum. We're playing a game of catch-up in the world economy in terms of investment. This requires efficient and timely decision-making, whether we're talking in the United States or in resource-holding countries. It also requires something else. It requires consistency. An on-again, off-again production tax credit is not a way to promote stable development of renewable energy. The PTC needs a longer-term horizon. And certainly in terms of investment, there is also a greater recognition of the role of investment in developing offshore oil resources. A quarter of our oil now comes from the offshore. A third of the entire world oil supply comes from the offshore. It's part of the portfolio. Uncertainty is the enemy of investment, and predictability is a vital ingredient. A third point, and follows from what Frank said, is understanding the relationship of the United States and the global energy markets. We have become more integrated. As Frank pointed out, we import about 56% of our oil. That's a lot of oil. We keep hearing 70%, but when we do our numbers, we keep coming up with 56%. It's still a very big number. But we are less influential in the global energy markets because our share has gone down because of growth elsewhere. And this emphasizes the need for a cooperative, multifaceted approach to relations both with other consumers and producers in the interests of our energy security. The final point I want to go to is expectations. And expectations is really, of course, what drives action. It drives policy. It's what brings us all together. It drives investment. It drives technological innovation. And the role of expectations hinges on what we think the future is going to be and what we need and what the urgency of it will be. I think a major contribution to a sounder energy future would be to create an environment that, based upon realistic assessments, that ensures that timely investment is really and convincingly and steadily on the way. The answer to today's energy problems, and more importantly, the answer to tomorrow's energy problems, is not either or. We need an ecumenical approach, a comprehensive and integrated approach, a combination of new oil and gas supplies, renewables, alternatives, efficiency, much more emphasis on innovation, all developed with the appropriate environmental and climate considerations in mind. Such an approach would be a great contribution not only to relieving what's obviously already been discussed this morning, relieving the pain and pressures that the American people are feeling at the pump, and the difficulties that are faced by American businesses today, whether large or small. It would also be a fundamental contribution to the future prosperity and security of our nation and to the global economy of which we are so centrally part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dan Riker, go right ahead, please.
Senator Bingaman, Senator Domenici, other senators here today, thank you for organizing this summit and for inviting me to participate. I serve as Director of Climate Change and Energy Initiatives for Google.org, a unit of Google which makes investments and advances policy in several areas, including climate change and energy. I previously served as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy and DOE Chief of Staff in the Clinton administration. I also was co-founder and president of New Energy Capital, a private equity firm focused on investments in clean energy projects. To meet the critical challenges of the 21st century, climate change, energy security, and economic development, we indeed need a bold new vision for how America generates and uses electricity. We must become smarter and more efficient in the way we use electricity, green our electricity supply through a massive scale-up of renewable energy, and electrify our transportation fleet with plug-in vehicles to reduce our dangerous oil dependence. Our vision is a 21st century U.S. electricity system featuring hundreds of thousands of megawatts of renewable power, millions of plug-in vehicles, and tens of millions of energy-efficient homes and businesses. The biggest impediment to achieving this vision is not technology or even finance. It is policy, particularly at the national level. The current regulatory model for electricity is broken. It does not encourage utilities to help people save energy. It retards renewable energy development. It discourages modernization of the grid. It fails to cut greenhouse gas emissions. We need to fundamentally rethink this model. Most importantly, we need to put a price on carbon in order to significantly reduce global warming pollution. Putting a price on carbon, however, will not be enough to drive the urgent changes we need in our energy system. In addition to national climate legislation, we also need aggressive and targeted federal energy legislation, and there are 4 critical elements. First, we need large-scale public and private investment in electricity infrastructure and modernization of the power grid. Spurring this investment will require overcoming the current barriers to siting and construction of new electricity infrastructure, especially large-scale transmission. This may require greater federal authority, balanced by strong environmental standards, to overcome resistance to long-distance interstate transmission lines that are essential to the development of large-scale renewables. Second, we need strong standards and incentives for clean energy. These include a national renewable energy standard, a national energy efficiency resource standard, and aggressive new appliance efficiency standards. And as Dan Yergin just explained, we also need stable, long-term tax credits and other financial incentives for energy efficiency, renewable energy, and plug-in vehicles. Third, we need the federal government to take a leadership role in an exciting recent development, the increasing interplay between energy hardware and information software, and the corresponding rise of the internet and the connectivity it brings. From smart meters and smart appliances to smart homes and a smart grid, we are poised to significantly advance our ability to make, monitor, and use energy more productively. And with smart policy, like revenue decoupling, we can align interests, putting utilities in the position to make money, helping consumers use less energy. Fourth, we need major increases in government R&D. We must dramatically scale up investment in research and development for clean energy technologies. Total federal energy R&D is less than half what it was at its peak in the late 1970s. Federal investment in this area will more than pay for itself, just as it has in computer science, aerospace, and biomedical research. If enacted, these measures should stimulate literally trillions of dollars of investment, largely from the private sector, over the next 3 decades to make the transition to a more efficient, low-carbon electricity system. They will also create millions of new jobs. This is an enormous opportunity. One quick example. American consumers get a paper utility once a month that is complicated and encourages little except prompt payment. What if utility customers had online, real-time information about their home energy use? What if their air conditioner, electronic equipment, appliances, and lights were programmed to automatically cut their bills? And what if their car ran on electricity instead of gasoline and automatically charged at night when electricity was cheaper, or during the day from the solar panels on the roof? These are exciting opportunities, but we are unfortunately a long way politically from making them happen. Sadly, the Congress has been unable to pass even a 1-year extension to renewable energy tax credits that will expire at the end of the year, to say nothing of more fundamental changes outlined above. But I am hopeful, with the progress of the last few weeks, that we might actually break the current impasse. And going forward, we have a big opportunity with a new president, a new Congress, and unprecedented concerns about high energy prices, our oil dependence, and climate change. There's never been a better moment. Let's seize the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Deutsch, go right ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Domenici, I first appeared in front of this committee somewhat over 30 years ago, when I was being considered for confirmation as the first Director of Energy Research at the Department of Energy. Scoop Jackson was in the chair, and I say that the Senator Domenici was a member of that committee. It has been my privilege and my pleasure to work with Senator Domenici both inside and outside of government when I've been in the Department of Energy, when I've been in the intelligence community, and when I've been in the Department of Defense. And I want to begin by taking this opportunity to tell him my tremendous respect, my gratitude for what he's done for the country, and my affection for Senator Domenici. Now, Senator Domenici will remember some of those events of the 1970s. President Nixon's Project Independence, which called on the United States to become independent of imported oil at a time when we were taking less than 20% of our oil from abroad. Senator Domenici will remember Vice President Rockefeller's 1975 proposal for $100 billion Energy Independence Authority. He will also recall President Carter's 1978 National Energy Plan. Oil and gas was deregulated in 1977, an action acknowledging that market forces are more efficient than government regulation to allocate energy to users. In 1978, I stood by President Carter in the Rose Garden when he announced that the United States would have 20% solar energy by the year 2000. There was a creation of the Synthetic Fuels Corporation, an effort to set backstop technologies to imported oil in synthetic oil and gas. And Congress has appropriated tens of billions of dollars for research and development and demonstration. I do not believe that the sum of all these efforts allows the country to meet its energy challenges for the future. We are not sufficiently rapidly making a transition from conventional oil and gas to other sources of energy. We have not reduced emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and avoiding the adverse consequences of climate change. We are not managing the foreign policy consequences of energy import dependence from politically unstable or unfriendly parts of the world, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. I offer 7 priority suggestions for what we should do to put ourselves on a path for taking care of our energy security. This is not a list which says pick some. It says you must do them all, and there are other things as well. First, I believe we need to establish a charge for greenhouse gas emissions. This charge ought to be large enough so that it increases the opportunity for better energy efficiency, the use of renewable energy sources such as wind, geothermal. It will help make nuclear a reality, and it will lead to carbon-free use of coal. The revenue from this charge should be used for impact assistance for groups such as the needy and the elderly that cannot be expected to carry the burden of higher energy prices. It should be used for energy research, development, and demonstration, and it should be used to offset other taxes so as to make the macroeconomic consequences of an energy charge like this less burdensome. Secondly, it is absolutely crucial that this country learns how to use its coal in a clean, carbon-free way. That means that the government must establish a much more aggressive program to demonstrate the regulatory framework, the technical performance, and the cost of carbon sequestration. I keep on pointing out that while there are many interesting efforts underway today in carbon capture and sequestration, there is yet no concrete plan for a large-scale project at scale, 1 million tons a year or greater, that demonstrates the proper sequestration of carbon. Third, we must improve the efficiency of our energy use. Fourth, it is critical that we accelerate the pace of energy innovation. The record does not point to the fact that the expenditures that have been made on energy research, development, and demonstration have been adequate to the needs of the country. there are several changes which could take place which would make energy innovation more successful in this country. The first is the creation of an Energy Innovation Council that would have a national energy research development demonstration plan involving all government agencies, not just the Department of Energy. Department of Energy expenditures certainly have to be increased, but that's not a complete solution. We have to launch a large integrated energy research and development program in critical areas such as batteries, cellulosic biomass, photovoltaics, gas separations, and the like. We need to establish a career path for people who have energy technology credentials within the civil service. I believe we need to consider establishment of an energy technology corporation to manage the demonstration projects that are so urgently needed. Examples include carbon sequestration, gas to liquids, smart electricity distribution grids, large-scale cellulosic biomass production, carbon capture and sequestration, first mover, once through nuclear power plants. Several people have mentioned the need to increase domestic oil and gas production. It is not only that it makes a contribution to our energy needs, but it is also an important signal to other countries that we need their production as well. If we do not do something at home, it is hard to convince other countries to increase their production. Sixth, we need to expand the use of commercial nuclear power. It is an essential carbon-free source of electricity. I know Congress has done a great deal to put in measures to increase the incentives for new first-of-a-kind nuclear power plants. The process is moving too slowly. The process is moving much too slowly. Seventh, we need to improve the coordination of energy policy. Let me just say that there is a fantastically close relationship between energy policy in the domestic area and our foreign policy. James Schlesinger and I have recently co-chaired a study for the task force for the Council on Foreign Relations on the national security linkage between oil and gas import dependence and foreign policy. It's incredibly important that we take into account in all of our foreign policy deliberations energy aspects, and in our domestic concerns, foreign policy implications of what we do. Let me just point out Iran. We have in Iran three conflicting problems. One is they produce about 3 million barrels of oil per day for the international market. Secondly, they're interested in acquiring a nuclear weapon. And third, they are not a constructive force in our efforts in bringing a secure country in Iraq. All of this indicates the interaction between energy, oil and gas especially, and our foreign policy efforts. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by noting that there's also a strong relationship between U.S. nuclear nonproliferation policy, our nuclear force structure, and our nuclear power and nuclear energy commercial developments. The Department of Energy is involved in all three aspects: nonproliferation, commercial power development, and of course being responsible for our nuclear weapons program. My experience as Undersecretary of Energy and as Chairman of the Department of Defense's Nuclear Weapons Council for 2 years leads me to believe that the transfer of those responsibilities for nuclear weapons from the Department of Energy elsewhere in the government to the Department of Defense or to some independent agency would be a mistake. You will hear proposals put before you of that kind. I do not believe that it would strengthen our role with respect to nuclear force structure, and I do not believe that it would strengthen our efforts with respect to energy research and development. Over the years, the national laboratories which are involved in weapons, Livermore, Los Alamos, and Sandia, have made a tremendous contribution to our energy R&D. That should be reinvigorated. It would strengthen both our energy efforts and it would strengthen our efforts at nuclear weapons security. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Odom, why don't you go right ahead?
Good morning, and thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the senators for allowing me to move to the morning meeting. As I'm sure you know, we have a rather large hurricane bearing down on the Texas coast, and I'm anxious to get back and deal with some of the business issues there. I can assure you, though, that the infrastructure is as prepared as it can be. We have the thousands of people that work in that industry in safe locations, and it will be returned to production as absolutely quickly as possible. I'd like to commend Senator Bingaman and Domenici for holding this summit, and all of the senators, of course, that are here today. I think it is precisely the kind of dialogue that our nation needs to have on energy policy. If we are going to successfully meet the energy challenge, we will need this type of cooperative spirit. It is an undeniable truth that we will need more of all kinds of energy, including that saved through efficiency and conservation. And by all kinds of energy, of course, I mean oil and gas, coal, biofuels, wind, solar, nuclear, hydrogen, and potentially others. Along with this, there are two other points that you've heard from me before. First, that oil and gas will remain critical fuels for our economy for decades to come. And second, we must develop all energies with particular attention to addressing CO2 emissions. As one of the largest oil and gas producers, I'm going to focus my comments on the oil and gas side of this equation. And then I'll conclude with just a few comments on the broader energy policy. The fact is that the U.S. imports much more petroleum than it should. And I'm not going to repeat all the numbers that we've heard before, but 12 million barrels a day, $600 billion a year to pay for that. The U.S. is in somewhat of a unique position among the world's nations in not producing more of our own resources, instead expecting others to produce it for us. I think the choice is fairly clear. We can continue to import ever more oil and gas as we transition to a new energy mix that's at an unknown point in time in the future, or we can develop more of our own resources. And we have potentially abundant resources. The U.S. has a well-designed system in place for managing oil and gas exploration and development. We also have a very strong system in place for ensuring that environmental impacts are avoided or mitigated. If more areas are open to oil and gas exploration, I think it is crucial that adequate funding be provided to federal agencies that manage those activities. When adequate funding is not in place, the system breaks down, permits are not issued on time, environmental studies are questioned, and the system is vulnerable to litigation. Just because lands are leased doesn't mean drilling will commence. And I'll use Alaska as a case in point. Alaska's Chukchi and Beaufort Seas are some of the most promising undeveloped hydrocarbon basins in the U.S. In the last couple of years, Shell has invested more than $2 billion in leases and hundreds of millions more in equipment, studies, permits, training, and other preparation, trying to bring more production to the U.S. market. We've assembled what is arguably the most environmentally sensitive and thoroughly responsible exploration program in history. But with permit slippage and litigation delay, we are nearly 3 years on and have yet to drill a single exploration well, let alone produce much needed oil and gas. And remember, this is an area that's open to leasing. Our drilling program in the Beaufort has been delayed now for a second year as the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has deliberated over a lawsuit against the MMS, and we still do not have a decision. I'd also like to comment on the topic of revenue sharing. It is important to recognize that states and communities adjacent to offshore development will have infrastructure needs such as roads, schools, and demands for basic public services. Revenue sharing is available for 4 Gulf of Mexico states, and it will help address some of those needs. Congress should routinely extend revenue sharing to other areas, starting with Alaska. So to close, the challenges we face today result, I think, from not having a comprehensive energy policy like we're talking about today. These challenges cannot be resolved with one simple solution. We need to face some hard truths and produce more energy, all forms of energy. And you're going to find a lot of commonality with the other panel members in these next couple of statements, because I believe a comprehensive energy policy should include providing more access to domestic oil and gas resources, encouraging more investment in alternatives and renewables, and there are some exciting things happening there, encourage and reward more conservation and efficiency, reduce CO2 emissions using market mechanisms, such as cap and trade, that enable such reductions, and also very much need to account for carbon capture and storage, which you heard from Mr. Deutsch. Now, we are committed to meeting the energy challenge and to working with Congress and the American people to find real solutions. In 2008, we will invest somewhere around $35 to $36 billion, which is more than our profits in 2007, to bring more energy to the world. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and our conversation. Thank you.
Thank all of you for excellent testimony. Let me start the questions, and then we will have questions from Senator Domenici, and then we'll go back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in the order that people arrived, and we have a long list. So I'll try to be brief in my question. One of the issues that I think we're going to have to better understand is, in order to reduce the use of petroleum in the transportation sector, there are sort of three options. Obviously, increased efficiency, everyone agrees, is important. But when you start looking at other ways to substitute for imported oil being used to be refined into gasoline for the transportation sector, there are sort of three options out there. One is the one that Dan Riker was referring to, which is electrify the transportation sector, get more and more of our vehicles operating off electrical power. Second, of course, is biofuels as a way to substitute for petroleum use directly. And a third is the proposal that T. Boone Pickens is advertising and advocating these days, which is the thought that we can meet many of our transportation needs through more use of natural gas rather than through use of gasoline refined from oil. I'd be interested in any of you who have an idea as to which of those courses is most promising to tell us what you think. I mean, obviously we're doing some of each. That's appropriate, but is there one of the three that holds the greatest promise, or one of the three that holds the least promise? Any of you have thoughts? Professor Deutsch?
Mr. Chairman, I'm all in favor of all three, but I want to just suggest to you, in each case, there's a significant barrier. In the case of substituting electricity, either for hybrid vehicles or all electric vehicles, we have to have the electricity. That means that it has to come either from clean coal or it has to come from nuclear. In the case of biofuels, we've looked at this in some detail. We don't want to compete with food. We want to have cellulosic biomass. There really is a limit of what you can expect from this. I would say that an aggressive limit for the United States would be like 2 billion barrels of oil equivalent a day. That's still a small fraction of what we need to do. And with respect to natural gas, let me point out North America has become an importer of natural gas. And natural gas is likely to become more and more for us like petroleum. So substituting natural gas and petroleum, yes, that's maybe a good thing to do in the short run. In the long run, they're both very important. Final point is the rest of the world is important here too. And the rest of the world is rushing to use more oil, like China, in their transportation system. So this is also has an international aspect, that the rest of the world is going to be consuming oil for automobile transportation at too high a rate.
Mr. Odom, did you have a thought about this?
If I could just add, I think it's a very important question because I think it points to an important topic that covers more than just this single question, which is, going back to what Dan Yergin said, there is no single answer here. So I listen to that question, I hear those three options, and I think they're all important, and they will all be part of the solution that we need for the energy challenge in the U.S. Neither one on its own will solve the problem.
Dan, did you want to comment?
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, I think, again, all three need to be part of the solution. I would put electrification of vehicles at the top of the list, though. And what's interesting, I think, is that this move that we're seeing in the marketplace today to hybrids actually allow us to take the first option, which is electrification, and combine it with the second option, which is biofuels. You can electrify a vehicle as General Motors and Toyota are doing, and those vehicles will be out next year or the year after. Meanwhile, there's a 12 or 14-gallon tank into which biofuels could go. So we could hybridize in yet another way those two technologies. Over time, we do have to make the transition away from corn-based ethanol to cellulosic ethanol for all the reasons that I think you know well. And I do think natural gas has a role. I would put it further down the list. Fleets, for example, buses, trucks, vehicles that come back to the same place at night. But I would say that should be a much smaller part of this mix going forward compared to electricity at the top of the list, biofuels in the middle, and natural gas at the bottom.
Frank?
Yes, I concur with Dan's points and also with Marvin. If you had to do priority ranking, it strikes me that in the short term, hybrid technology is just terrific. If you can increase the vehicle standards and current technology, you can increase it you can double. So what the Congress did in the Energy Efficient Act was terrific, maybe not aggressive enough. If you double the mileage, $4 gasoline becomes $2 gasoline. If you supplement that with plug-in hybrids, you have the opportunity to have both liquid fuels and electricity. Going to fully electric, it just strikes me there's three questions. One is on efficiency. At least now, until we upgrade the grid, it takes 3 units of primary energy at the front end to give you 1 unit of electricity at the back end. So, which leads to the second point of what's your fuel source. And base load, as John said, it's either nuclear or coal. Could be natural gas. Is not the scale up for renewables yet at this point. Third point is reliability. At this situation, ice storms, wind, squirrels can take down the system. We need to make sure that the system is reliable. On compressed natural gas, I would agree with Dan. I think it's lower down the list for fleets, especially for buses. It's terrific. You can secure the size of the gas tank because as you compress the natural gas, your mileage efficiency goes down. Your miles able to be driven on a tank of CNG is lower. So for cabs, city cabs, something that's used on campuses, maybe local police forces, and for buses, great idea. For the general public, probably not there yet.
Senator Domenici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm very pleased to see so many senators here that want to ask questions. That I want to just ask 3. First, Professor Deutsch, I think you know, speaking of nuclear power for a moment, we're making some fantastic strides as a nation now with reference to applications for nuclear power plants. As you know, we have gone from 0 applications for license applications for design and construction before the passage of the Energy Policy Act to what's contemplated now is a total of 23 applications, 34 units. I would say that's a rather significant leap forward by the United States, a commitment, I would say, to going nuclear as rapidly as we can, consistent with the delicate nature of the licensing process. But you stated we're going too slow on the licensing. I really want you to believe me that I think that's the case, but I cannot find any way to use less time in the process. And if you and your people at MIT can look at the licensing process and tell us how we can save time, you would do us a great favor. The only thing we have done, and I just give it to you outright, we put 1 year after the licensing process is finished for citizen involvement because there are so many institutional approaches, institutional negatives. They file against this, that you've got to give them some time or you'll end up with never-ending legislation, litigation. So we are using 1 year in this 42 months that we claim is necessary. If you can find how we would do it with less, I believe everybody would be interested in hearing. Now, if you already know, you can tell us now. If not, I will go to the next question. I think that's what I thought would happen. Now, let me say to Dr. Yergin, this is the second time you've appeared to help us, and I want to tell you personally, as I leave, what great admiration I have for you. I just whispered to my friend, the chairman, that if I were putting together any group of as small as 5 advisors on energy policy to help us, I would put you on that 5. I might even put you on the 3 if we went that far. So I want to ask you a question. How did we move so quickly from an American energy scene which was short of natural gas? Even we were even beating ourselves up for using natural gas as our to make electricity because we claimed we didn't have enough. All of a sudden, we're talking like we have so much. I seem to believe we have much more than we thought, but how do we? Where are you in terms of proving that up? Where do we get the information that we have so much more natural gas than we thought we had?
Well, first, thank you for your more than gracious words. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And as with Professor Deutsch, have great admiration for the role you've played in energy over these many years and the consistency you've brought to it. I think the big change on natural gas has been, what you see in the energy industries constantly is this process of innovation. It looks like you're in a dead end and then something changes it. And what's changed it is in terms of the development of unconventional gas. And I think and probably Mr. Odom can add to that, but over the last 2 years or 3 years, what seemed to be a very much of a fringe activity has now put us in a more abundant position. Last year, our gas production went up 9% after many years of thinking that we were going to be tied into a global LNG market, which, as Professor Deutsch said, we are, but not to the extent. And so I think it's still unfolding. And one big question about it is this kind of a short-term rush, or does this really open up a whole new horizon for natural gas in our economy? So I think that's been, to me, the biggest reason for the change of perspective over the last 2 years.
Last question is, the price of oil has dropped nearly $50 in the past 2 to 3 months. Dr. Yergin says that softened demand has caused that. Do you agree? And we'll start over there at your end. Do you agree?
I think there's 3 or 4 pieces that go into this. Clearly, reduction in demand, and part of that is a result of higher prices. The second is, I think, the prospects for additional production coming online. Projects that were delayed last year because of cost and technical difficulties, we're going to start seeing them 3rd and 4th quarter of this year, 1st quarter of next year. So we're going to have a supply. We also have alternative fuels that have made a huge contribution, and we're seeing demand reduction. Technology has played a big role, and a personal view is that there has been price speculation in the market, and I think the drop from $147 to $100 over the last several weeks should indicate this is more than just fundamentals.
Right. Did you want to add anything, Dr. Yergin, to my statement of your position?
Well, I think those other factors are certainly part of it as well. In other words, it isn't just one thing, but I think this demand, the shift in demand and the focus on demand is a very important part of it. And certainly, as Frank said, the financial markets have been playing a much more important role in the oil market than they had in previous years. Yeah. Oh, yes. And Frank whispered to me, very important, is the strength of the dollar. I mean, we've seen an inverse move between the dollar and commodities and the change of the dollar, and we've seen all the commodity prices come down.
Thank you.
Senator Dorgan.
Mr. Yergin, when you described the financial markets playing a much more important role, that's part of what Mr. Vistasras talked about with respect to speculation as a portion of that. Is that correct? Is that what you mean?
Speculation is part of it, but it's more generally that the financial markets are engaged. It's also pension funds concerned about the equity markets, in turn concerned about delivering returns, looking at commodities as an asset allocation class.
Mr. Chairman, let me say that I hope that this, which I think is a wonderful opportunity today, is perhaps the first in a series of urgent hearings that we would hold to put together the comprehensive plan that could come from a series of different centers of thought and interest here on a comprehensive energy policy. It appears to me that $4 for a gallon of gasoline became the tipping point, and that filled the political system with enough helium to make things interesting and to have crowds gathered chanting "Drill, baby, drill," and it filled the policy discussion with enough urgency so that everybody's now talking about comprehensive energy legislation. So, I mean, this is certainly on the right subject at the right time. My own view is we should do everything, drill. And by the way, the one thing that nobody's talking about, it's a small piece, but there's estimated 500,000 barrels of oil a day that the Cubans are making available, and the Canadians and the Spanish and the Chinese and others are able to lease, and we're not. That ought to be part of the drilling that American firms ought to be able to access. But drilling, conservation, efficiency, renewables, all of it has to be a part of what we're about with respect to comprehensive energy legislation, and also addressing what I think is excess speculation in the markets. But what I'd like to ask, if we don't do something, we should do all of these things, but the question is, what is game-changing? What is it that can bring us back 15 years from now or 15 years of that after that to not be talking about the same set of problems? Because Mr. Yergin talked about 30 years ago. Every 15 or so years, we hang around thumbing suspenders talking about the same old issues, which I call yesterday forever. What is game-changing? What truly is game-changing here? Of the things that have been discussed by the witnesses, what do you say to us that you think in policy represents something that really is game-changing for America's future energy use in terms of how you would prioritize it?
Senator, when you roll back to the 1970s, we were in a totally different place. I would argue that we had excess capacity in the 70s, and we actually were playing with that through the last 25 years. So we had excess refining capacity, excess crude oil capacity, excess transmission capacity. The growth of China, but also of the non-OECD countries, have tightened up the demand-supply balance. People didn't make the investments because there had been an overhang. 2004 to us was kind of the watershed year where everyone took notice that things were in tight supply. Players behave differently in a tight market. We consistently want to go back and say, well, what are the tools that we used in the 80s and 90s? And they're the wrong tools because that was in a surplus market. So in terms of priorities, it just strikes me that the first thing you do when you look at this increasing projection of global demand is unless you change the curve, you're constantly chasing this elusive target where you increasingly have to plug in various forms of supply. And the above-ground issues that I alluded to, and they're everything from access to commerciality to sabotage and terrorism, distribution, infrastructure, investment. It's not the molecules in the ground that seem to be the problem at this point, because I think the endowment, the resource endowment in the world is enormous. But accessing them, converting them, then delivering to places where they're needed is the issue. So the first and foremost thing is to change demand. And I think on the transportation side for oil, going to hybrids tomorrow in a broader scale is a no-brainer. We have the technology, and if you can reduce demand by 50%, by definition, you reduce oil imports. Maintaining U.S. production is the second piece of that, though, especially on the liquid fuel side. Because if you let the U.S. go into decline, even if you take the demand curve down, the gap is still filled by imports. And at some point, we have to make room for China and India. Otherwise, we're competing for all these fuels in the market. And like oil, natural gas will soon become like a bidding war on eBay. And this is the second piece on natural gas. On the gas piece, I think technology has really helped. These unconventional plays, subsalt plays on the oil side, things we couldn't see 15 years ago with horizontal drilling, looking at permeability and porosity of the zones, you can actually move the gas through. With fracturing, you can do the same with shale oil like we're doing in the Bakken. It's a different type of play. But these are supplements. They're not replacements. This transition that I think we're all looking for, where you have fuels that are available, affordable, reliable, and environmentally benign, all require trade-offs. So Dan and I and Marvin were all part of this National Petroleum Council study that we produced last year. And we constructed this triangle. And triangle said you have to look at economics, you have to look at environmental performance, and then you have to balance that against security. Ideally, you like to be in the center of the triangle, where all three issues are balanced. Efficiency and low emissions fuels are the only thing that fit in the center of the triangle. Everything else that you play with, whether it's nuclear or coal or natural gas, they all have trade-offs. So they may benefit you on the economic side, cost you on the foreign policy side, benefit you on the environmental side, but cost more somewhere else. I think that's the juncture we're at.
Mr. Chairman.
I think we need to manage the transition is the point I'm getting to. We want to get to a different future, but there's smart things you need to put in place now. We're resetting the system.
Yeah.
The next president is a transition president.
Mr. Chairman, might I just make a 30-second observation? I understand you want to move to others. It seems to me that in the infancy of various approaches to deal with this, renewables and conservation approaches and so on, we moved towards what we incent. And we incented people to go look for oil and gas. I got from the Congressional Research Service the other day, on 2 of the tax incentives for people that go look for oil and gas, we have provided $177 billion of tax incentives in the last 40 years. That's a pretty robust, aggressive incentive. Compare that with what we've done with other things that might be game-changing, renewables and so on, which is pathetic and anemic. So, I mean, I think we really have to evaluate what is game-changing, and then how do we pursue it with the right kind of robust incentives that you can count on.
Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for their insights today and observations about what we all perceive to be a major issue affecting the economy in this country, and I would argue is a national security issue as well. I think that the triangle that you described is a good one, because I believe that there are lots of implications that go beyond just the clear economic impact this has on people across this country. And in my view, in a state like South Dakota and some of the members here who represent rural states, the impacts are even more profound, because you've got largely agricultural economies that are very energy dependent. Diesel, fertilizer, all the input costs that go into agricultural production continue to go up as a result of what we're facing across the world today in terms of the increasing global demand for all forms of energy, but particularly for fuels. And we've got a number of things that we've been looking at, and I appreciate the observations with respect to efficiencies and conservation and everything else, trying to address this in a balanced way. I guess my question would be, of all those different types of technologies, what do you perceive to be the one that we can realize the most quickly? A lot of the things that we're talking about are 5-year, 10-year issues. We're all looking at how do we bridge to that technology, and right now I think we are in a transitional time. I think we're, the oil and gas production, things that we're doing today, the energy sources that we rely upon today, I think are designed as a bridge to get us to those new technologies and that future energy source. But we obviously want to get there as quickly as possible. And in my part of the world, we're working to develop as fast as we can cellulosic ethanol. We've had great success with corn-based ethanol. 1.7 billion gallons in 2001. This year it's over 9 billion gallons. So much so that many of our producers are saying we're going to run into what they call the blend wall. And that is that we've got a lot of production. We don't have enough demand out there right now because we have limitations on how much can be blended. As a result of that, the price of ethanol has gone down dramatically relative to gasoline, to the point where it's becoming very difficult for producers to find any kind of a margin right now in corn-based ethanol. And we're trying to push towards cellulosic ethanol. And we're very close. I mean, I've been out at NREL, and they've done some wonderful things in terms of testing there. The key is to make it commercially viable. That's kind of the world I live in. We're very much into biofuels where I come from. But I guess my question for all of you is, which of these various technologies that have been talked about are the most, I guess, that we would have an opportunity to realize some benefit from in the shortest amount of time?
Let me just jump in with part of the answer, because I think your question very much ties into Senator Dorgan's question and where Senator Bingaman was. To me, it seems when you look at it all, the agenda is pretty clear, that there are list of things, and I think Frank has done a very good point of pointing out we want to skip over hybrids, but hybrids themselves are pretty darn important. But I think, you know, are we going to see 5 years from now is the big surprise. And when I look at the energy history, you always see that there are these big surprises that come. Is the big surprise going to be in biofuels that we don't see it, or is it going to be electricity and transportation, or maybe something that we don't even quite see? In the near medium term, it does seem to me that the big source that we have, if we can figure out how to handle it, because it's not one thing, is efficiency, and that's what gives us an awful lot of, it gives us time to address these other things. And then it's have a consistent process that John Deutsch described so that we don't have the stop and go on the technologies, and that we have young people who are making careers in science in it, so that 35 years from now, we're not reading another Time magazine article that's now 70 years old that still sounds like where we were. I'll just tell you, when I looked at that Time magazine article, lots changed since we didn't have Google, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have PCs, but you look at the agenda 35 years ago, and it sounds to some degree like the agenda we're talking about today. So there is that sense that we need, but I don't think we know the answer on what the game changer is, what the big innovation, and that's why we've got to go down several paths at the same time.
Yeah, could I just echo that, Senator? It's not sexy, but energy efficiency, I do think, is the fastest, cheapest, near-term resource that we've got. You simply look at the cost of electricity from, high-cost photovoltaics at one end, even coal, lower down the scale, nuclear, natural gas. Vastly cheaper is energy efficiency at a couple of cents a kilowatt hour. And I just would urge you to take a look at what California has been able to do over the last 30 years, keeping its per capita electricity use flat over 30 years, while in the rest of the country it's risen 40 to 50%. And there's three things that the state did very wisely. One, it actually gave utilities the incentive. They can make money in California encouraging efficiency, encouraging people to use less electricity. Most of the rest of the country, you can't do that, so the incentive is to sell more. The second thing the state did very early on was to adopt aggressive building codes. Again, very boring stuff, I have to admit it, but very aggressive building codes, and so what gets built there is vastly more efficient than in most of the rest of the country. And the third thing was to launch a real serious effort in appliance standards, electronic equipment standards. Again, terribly boring, but it has really driven a lot of change. In fact, caused what we've been able to do at the federal level to finally get off the ground. So California is a great example, and I think if we had done that in the rest of the country, our total energy use would be dramatically lower today. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but it's significant. Second game changer, completely other end of the spectrum. Several weeks ago, we and several venture capital firms made an announcement about an advanced geothermal technology. John Deutsch may remember the days of what we used to call hot, dry rock back in the Carter administration. But essentially, instead of traditional geothermal where you drill down to a pocket of steam or hot water, this modern geothermal technique, you can literally drill anywhere in the United States or all over the globe, and at some point you get to hot, dry rock. There may not be water there, but if you can put a fluid down there and bring it back up, you can make steam and turn a turbine and make electricity. The oil companies are very interested in this. The Australians lead the world. The EU has made significant investments. This technology is being proven out. A major MIT study in 2007 told us that 2% of the heat energy between 3 and 10 kilometers below the United States, 2% of that, if we could capture it, represents 2,500 times U.S. energy use. The oil companies know how to drill to those depths. They know how to fracture rock. They know how to move fluids around. If we could take that kind of drilling, apply it to this enhanced geothermal systems, as we call it, EGS approach, I think we may be there with a new technology that's base load as opposed to solar and wind, which are intermittent, which is ubiquitous, literally from border to border and coast to coast. The joke I tell is that if the big dig in Boston had been vertical instead of horizontal, at $12 billion, we might be making electricity in New England right now from deeper geothermal. So this is a very interesting breakthrough technology, Major venture capital firms in the United States are beginning to take a step. We at Google have put money into a couple of companies. We're supporting the development of a new heat map for the United States. I would strongly encourage you to take a look at that.
We're going to run out of the opportunity for members to ask questions here before we run out of members. So let me, I think we'll try to stick with a 5-minute rule at this point. Senator Cantwell, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's been good this last conversation because it goes to questions that I have. First, I want to say that Senator Dorgan and myself and other members of the Energy Subcommittee are having a hearing next week on the continuation of speculation, so thank you.
I think your microphone's not on.
The red light's on. Maybe a
Oh, it
little
is,
closer
okay.
there. My question is, well, one, I wanted to comment about your points about speculation because I do think it's an important issue. We have seen a $6.7 billion savings to businesses and consumers since the price has gone down. And while part of it might be reduction in demand, we're seeing a export out of the market of large volumes of capital that just happened to coincide with the same time that we have decided to be more aggressive from a regulatory perspective. So $6.7 billion in savings to consumers and businesses is a big deal to our U.S. economy. Hopefully, we might even see the price go down below $100 a barrel, which would be pretty remarkable that we've seen this run up in such a short period of time. But my question is really about avoiding this for the future, and you were just talking about this as it relates to energy efficiency. I love Professor Deutsch that you mentioned Scoop Jackson, because I think if he was here, he would have said, listen, we went through this in the 70s and we didn't act. So what is it going to take for us to act today? And my point is we're having this discussion about drilling versus energy efficiency, renewables, and the investment. And I think EIA basically says that, you know, if you opened up all the outer continental shelf, you did all the drilling that you possibly could do, you're only talking in the next, you know, by 2030, in the hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil. But juxtaposed to that, their own calculations is you could have enough from wind power to build the equivalent of 50 new coal plants. So you all have talked about energy efficiency and renewables and technology, and so I'm just asking you, as you look at the next 20 to 30 years, so that we can calibrate this for the American public, I'm interested in knowing, are you saying that the majority of the opportunity that we have before us in driving down that price, or let's just say, because there's many factors there, I'm sure Mr. Yergin would say there's many factors here, but the majority of the opportunity that exists before us in having new supply and getting a reduction in foreign oil has to do with renewables and efficiency and new technology platforms. Professor Deutsch?
I don't know really quite how to begin with this. Let me just say the single most important issue with wind at large scale and with other renewable sources such as photovoltaics or central thermal power is the intermittency of the supply. It is not base load. So somehow you have to find a way to manage that intermittency. That means energy storage. So if you said to me what would be the one single thing which would really make a difference would be...
No, my question, if you could comment on this, is the majority of the opportunity before us on renewables and efficiency and new technology versus drilling? I think we're having this debate around here as if everybody thinks that drilling is going to be the majority of solution impact for us. And I hear you all talking about the big opportunities in these new areas, and that's why I wanted to know where you thought the majority of the opportunity existed.
It's certainly not in drilling, but drilling is an important component of doing this because it tells other producers in the world that we're doing our share in trying to keep supply up.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert?
As I said, I think the biggest opportunity is, in fact, to do more with less. Efficiency is the near-term opportunity. I think added to that, we are seeing a a very heartening decline in the price of producing renewable electricity and renewable fuels, and I think adding that to the mix. So I think the big components going forward that we can seize are, in fact, inefficiency in renewables. Obviously, the traditional fuels are going to be with us for a long, long time, and we need to ensure those supplies. But if we could lower demand and if we could start to aggressively move alternatives in, I think that will both be better off from an economic standpoint as well as an environmental standpoint.
Senator.
Okay, Senator Corker.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. I think most of us have heard or been with all of you in the
Did I
past.
cut you off, Dr. Jurgen? Did you want to make a comment before?
Well, just very quickly, I think there's a little bit of apple and oranges. I mean, wind is growing fast. It's 30% of our new electricity added last year. But wind, unless all of our cars are plug-in hybrids, doesn't do much at all for oil because there's only about 2% of our electricity is generated with oil. And I think in terms of the offshore, the EIA, it's very interesting what they have calculated, but the evidence for it is based upon 30-year-old, 35-year-old technology because there's no exploration. And the example is Brazil started its ethanol program because they didn't have any oil. In their deep offshore, they have just now discovered something that people are now saying may be as large as the North Sea. They didn't know it was there 5
Not
years
to have a debate, Mr. Chairman, but we've had Brazil, and guess what? Did we see the price go down? No, we didn't. Since Brazil's discovery, we've had the ride of our lives, and America cannot continue to have this kind of roller coaster.
Senator Corker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of you for your testimony. The thing that I'm struck most by in your testimony is the commonality, and that is that each of you seem to believe that we need to do all of the above. I've just gone through an experience with others to help craft a bill. And we had a rule that said that unless everyone agreed, even though some of it may be hard to digest, it would not occur. As I listen to you, and here we have a representative from Big Oil, okay? We have a representative, if you will, from the geeky side of energy, Mr. Riker, and we're glad you're here. And we are glad all of you are here. You have various, certainly varying backgrounds. I would like to ask the question, you've listened to each other's testimony. Do you disagree with anything that, I know you might weight them slightly different, and that's what compromise is all about. But is there anything that you disagree with that one of the other witnesses might have said? Yes, sir. Big Oil.
So maybe consistent with the way you asked the question, largely the answer is no. I don't think there's an inconsistency. And I think this response that I hope is coming through of it's not this versus that, it's we need to do all of these is important. And I think that if I could go back to the game changer comment, I hope that the game changer here is that we set a policy in place that's looking 20, 30, 40, and 50 years out and saying where does the U.S. want to be at that point in time, and then we stick to that policy because we'll have lots of variation in between, but we have to stay focused on that long-term picture.
Are there any disagreements? The geeky side is coming up here. I don't.
Again, the way you phrase the question, we do need to do everything. It is, though, the relative weighting when it comes to federal policy, when it comes to appropriations, when it comes to tax incentives, when it comes to how we support R&D. We have limited time, we have limited capital, both public and private. So that the devil is, unfortunately, in the details. But indeed, we do need a broad portfolio going forward. If I had to weight this, I would say the big opportunity to first cut demand, lower what we need, so whether it's traditional or alternative supplies that we then meet remaining demand with, we lower those needs as well. So cutting demand, whether it's respect to transportation fuels or electricity, we've got to do that first. It's the low-hanging fruit, and low-hanging fruit grows back. There are always continuing opportunities that come up as a result of technological progress. So that, to me, ought to be the going in for all of us across the board from the traditional to the alternative side.
Mr. Chairman, I know have a little time left, and I'd just like to say that these are really diverse witnesses, and they each have said that we need to do all of the above. And I am absolutely convinced that if the Senate decided, if leadership decided that we really wanted to pass an energy bill, that we could pass an energy bill with 70 votes. I believe that with all of my heart. And I just hope that this summit leads to us, whenever leadership decides it's in the best interest of the Senate, that I hope that we will actually pass a bill. And I thank you for having this. I think this testimony has shown from 5 very diverse people that in the Energy Committee, that people that actually focus 100% of their time on energy, there's lots of commonality, and I think that commonality is represented in the Senate too. And I thank you for this hearing.
Senator Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again for holding this hearing. Mr. Odom, let me start with you, if I may, and that is that in the Congress right now, there are several proposals floating around about drilling. I think the House has a proposal, maybe a Republican proposal. I think that Senator Bingaman's working on a proposal. There's been several senators grouped together in a bipartisan group. And by the way, Saxby, what's our number now? We started at G10, and we're at 20? 20 and growing. So we have 20 plus senators who are working together on a bipartisan solution. But let me ask you if you could help us, all of us in the Senate, understand about drilling. And this is something that our group has talked about. How much new drilling can the industry handle, let's say over the next, say, 7 years? I'll just pick that number. I mean, some proposals are let's just open all the outer continental shelf. Some are let's take the east Gulf Coast and maybe some other areas. And I think the group of 20 senators, we've really talked about where we want to go where we know oil is and you have some infrastructure and some ability to get to that oil relatively quickly. So help us work through that if you can. How much should we open? How quickly should we open it?
Couple of views on that. And where I would start is that I think what we shouldn't underestimate is the industry as a market, the industry's response to the higher prices and the higher demand for energy. And I don't know that a lot of that response is very visible yet. We can already see it on the demand side, for example, demand for oil being down over 900,000 barrels a day in 2008. The industry is responding in a similar way. And the piece I've pointed to as an example lately is and these are rough numbers, not exact numbers, but deep water rigs. There's a lot of production. We talked about offshore and how important it is. Deep water rigs, there's 30 of those in the world right now, and they're all 30 working, every one of them.
Right.
But in the next 5 years, they're going to be somewhere between 80 and 90 deep water rigs because those are being built all over the world. So is the industry stressed in terms of infrastructure? Yes. Is it stressed in terms of having enough people to do all of this work? Yes. But there is a response to that, and that is what's happening. And during the process of opening up areas for leases, doing the proper environmental studies that you do before you open those areas is the time that will be used to build up that infrastructure.
Does it make sense to you, though, that we go first where we're fairly confident that there is oil and infrastructure? Is that a good place to start?
I do think it's in terms of the quickest production that could come on, the closer you are to infrastructure, the better off we're going to be. I think that's true. I think, I'll go back to something I said in my statement. I just can't help it, which is we have areas that are open now, but we're being blocked from actually pursuing. And I don't think we should lose sight of that either, and that was my offshore Alaska example.
Well, we're aware of that. We've been talking about that in our group. Let me ask the group, all the panelists, if I may, a question, and that is, in our group of 20 senators bill that we're proposing, these ideas we put out, I don't know if all of y'all have seen sort of the concepts that we're all talking about. They sound very consistent with what all the panelists said today, but one of the things we call for is an Apollo-style project to try to get our vehicles off of oil. I think the goal we set is over the next 20 years, we want to see at least 85% of all new vehicles sold in the U.S. Use non-petroleum fuel sources. And first, I'd just like to hear from the panel if you think that is a good goal. It's something that we should, as a matter of public policy, pursue. And then secondly, I'd just like to hear from the panel if there's any concerns that you all have with the G20 proposal as far as you know. Mr. Deutsch.
Senator, I first of all want to say how unfortunate I think it is to use analogies like Apollo Project and Manhattan Project for these kinds of issues. Those technology-driven projects, which were so successful in our country's history, occurred in a completely government sector creation, application, and execution. Here we're talking about having a technology deployed into a real economy where people are, making consumer decisions. So I just want to say that the issue here is much more demanding. That's the first point. And the second point, I would also want to caution against specific targets, percentage targets. As I mentioned in my comments, I've been embarrassed about overly optimistic targets in the third point has to do with actually how are you going to displace the use of petroleum or natural gas in vehicles. And I would say here the group should have a responsibility of tracking that they actually have the electricity, production, storage, and distribution to carry it out as it grows. And I think you are going to have some real strains if you really have the kinds of numbers you were referring at in producing in the United States the electricity generation capacity that you have in mind, because I don't think we have an environment for new coal plants or for new nuclear plants. And as we know, the renewable, geothermal, and other electricity generating technologies are coming along slower. So I ask you to pay attention. When I looked at the plan, I haven't looked at it in great detail, I was worried about the accompanying management of the electricity supply.
Senator Chambliss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Professor Deutsch, I think what you just said just highlights the complexity of this issue and why I'm frankly disappointed that this room is not packed with all 100 senators, because as we think through this, a lot of times things seem simple. You just produce more oil, you manufacture more gasoline, and all of a sudden the price comes down. But you've just hit on something that's so critically important that I do wish that all senators were here to hear that, because it highlights to me, and as we have been through this dialogue over the last 3 months in our group, how truly complex this issue is. Mr. Obermeyer, I want to get back to you on a two-part question. One thing that I hear about as I'm back home, obviously the number one issue, the number two issue, and the number three issue is gas prices. But one thing I consistently hear from folks is that we haven't had a refinery built in this country in 25 years, and we need more refineries built. And I'd like for you to address that as to whether or not you do have the capacity to manufacture additional supplies. Secondly, let me let you address that first. I don't want to complicate my second question.
Well, and I'll try to keep the answer just as straightforward. As a company, I'll start by saying that we, along with our partners, are investing $7 billion in a refinery in Texas, on the Texas coast, unfortunately in the path of the hurricane as we speak. But that will effectively increase the size on the order of a new refinery. That's an enormous project. And I think what should be done is an assessment of all the expansions that are taking place across the U.S. And I think what you'll find is there is quite a bit of investment in refining capacity. The second thing is to look and just to make sure we all understand how difficult it is, then that's a brownfield expansion, of course, how difficult it is to build a refinery in a greenfield area, to get a permit and then to be allowed to make that investment to build a refinery is very challenging, which is why we're focused on existing facilities and expanding those.
Yeah. Second question, from an oil company perspective, obviously you're in business to make money, but I think you're also clearly in business to try to provide a energy source to your customers. What, from an oil company perspective, can be done immediately to help lower gas prices? And I don't mean over the next 30 days. I mean, I'm talking about realistically, whether it's 12 months or 36 months, but short term, from an oil company perspective, what do you think could be done?
Well, I really, I wish I had something on the order of a magic answer to that, which I don't. So I think it's the things that we've already mentioned on this panel. It's efficiency and conservation are going to be the most near-term significant impacts that we can have on prices. And I think beyond that, it goes very quickly to the all of the above answer in terms of we need to bring the accessible oil and gas resources online as quickly as we can, but be working on these alternatives at the same time.
Right. And there again, that goes back to Professor Dorsey's answer there that this thing is so complex, and we've tried to address all of the above. I think it's the only legislation that's out there right now that seeks to do that. And obviously, you're going to get a lot of criticism when you seek to address all of the above. Dr. Yergin, I was recently made aware of an MIT study which concluded that speculative activity in the futures market was a driving force behind the increased crude oil prices. The study largely dismissed any relevance associated with the weak dollar, the political instability in some producing nations, and the basic supply and demand situation. I'm curious to know if you agree with this particular study's conclusion that a speculative bubble is the leading cause of the price increase, and that these other factors, such as the dollar, such as production and the instability in those countries and supply and demand for sweet crude oil, had little, if any, impact on both the rise and fall of crude oil prices over the summer.
Well, I haven't seen that study. I've just heard about it. I think that's probably not one of Professor Deutsch's studies, but from somebody else. I think that I think it's kind of absurd to say that. Look, in my testimony, I cite the Federal Reserve that says between 2003 2007, a significant part of the increase in the price of oil before the final run-up was because of a weakening dollar. So to dismiss the dollar seems to me to not make any sense. To dismiss demand is truly absurd because what we've had since 2004 is a demand shock. In 2004, Chinese oil demand went up 16%. We went into 5 years of the best economic growth that we'd had in a generation. And lo and behold, the best economic growth in a generation with China and India coming into the picture was going to drive oil demand. And I think so. Demand, I think, has actually been the starting point. There are a lot of other things on top of it. I don't know if this study also dismisses disruptions in Nigeria, losing 40% of their oil, Venezuelan capacity being down 1 million barrels a day, Mexican capacity going down, Russian production flattening out. So these are all part of this mix, and those have been very significant. So in shorthand, I guess I would say I look forward to reading that study.
Senator Ben Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully, as a result of this effort and the gang's efforts, we'll move from trying to score political points to finding solutions to the challenges that we all face and the questions that are raised when we go home about the energy issues and what we're going to do to find solutions. Hopefully, this will help us along in the course, I think, that's been charted. As we look at the efforts to find new sources and we look for new solutions and new technologies, it's reasonably clear that we do face certain inhibitors and prohibitors to moving as quickly as we would like to. And I'd like to ask a question, for example, on nuclear. Even if we were able to move the number of permits consistent with the applications as quickly as possible, is there U.S. construction capacity to build 23 nuclear plants in the United States in a reasonably short period of time? I want to get to the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about, so that we realize that no matter what policy we set forth, we have to deal with the reality. I'm not negative about it. I just want to be realistic about it. Would anybody like to respond to that? Professor Deutsch?
We have looked at this in our MIT study on nuclear energy of 2003, and we're redoing that study right at the present time. It's no question about the fact that there is ability to build nuclear plants in this country. I would say to you that 20 plants would take a good deal of time. And I would also point out that...
Can you be even more specific than a good deal of time? Or?
Well, it would certainly take, and I might want to give you a more precise answer, it would certainly take 15 years, something in that order. But what I would like to say is we've really reduced the amount of domestic U.S. industry expertise in nuclear. And that would have to be built back over time if it's going to be a major contributor. That is, if it's going to maintain its 20% contribution for electricity into the future. So we have some questions about how to rebuild our domestic nuclear industry and not
well,
just
we could accelerate it, but there would be certain limits on how fast we could accelerate it.
That's correct.
Would it help if we took the approach that I understand the French are taking, more of a standardized plant or a cookie-cutter approach, so that every new application doesn't have to involve the technical review that it gets today?
Yes, I think but I think that is happening, sir. I think that the industry and the NRC and the Department of Energy are going for standardized plant designs by 2 or 3 manufacturers. The truth is, I mean, the real fact is we can do better. We have, I mean, 1 plant per year would be nice. We don't have 1 plant under construction right now, but we have some capacity. A lot has to be done.
Well, how fast will standardization accelerate the permitting process? Because the rumors and some facts would indicate that it may take twice as long to get a permit as it does to build a plant.
Senator, I want to say something. This goes back to a remark made by Senator Domenici.
Yes.
When I talk about the barriers to expanding the deployment of nuclear, it is not principally because of licensing. It has to do with the cost of these plants. It has to do with issues of giving confidence on waste management. There are several other elements that are required before nuclear really takes off. And I did not ever imply, nor do I believe, that the most urgent matter is to get licenses out of the NRC quicker. It's these other issues that I think are important.
But some of the staffing problems that were mentioned, and making certain that we have them and the budgets of the agencies are adequate to take care of the technological work, would apply to the electricity grid as well, would it not?
Yes.
And do you have any thoughts about whether there ought to be a single agency in charge of siting, permitting, so that it doesn't get caught in the bureaucracy between DOE and FERC?
I'm going to get myself into trouble here, but
I'll try to help you out.
I would say I'm a great believer that FERC should have authority on nuclear, on all electricity license locations, grid, like we have for natural gas, the ability to set high grid power lines. I think the authority of FERC should be greatly expanded in this regard relative to the states.
Well, and if you don't do that, won't you be in a consistent position of ambidextrous ambiguity between the various agencies? The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, or they're at odds?
That's my opinion, yes, sir.
Okay. Is there any other opinion?
Please make the opinion brief.
Yes, just to be clear,
the red light's on.
We're talking about 2 different things. One is nuclear licensing, which I'm assuming we're continuing to
No, I'm talking
at the
about
NRC.
grid.
And then in terms of transmission siting, we're talking about FERC. And I think I would agree that greater authority on the part of the FERC to build transmission capacity is important. But environmental standards, we're going to have to deal with state interest. But we need to build out transmission capacity in this country if we're going to have any hope of taking advantage of the renewable capacity.
Thank you for dealing with the nitty-gritty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Voinovich.
You talked about the fact that the world has changed, and I look at the geopolitical situation that we're. A couple of years ago, I attended a session of the National Defense University and walked out of there quite frightened about the security implications of our relying on foreign sources of oil in terms of interruption in the flow of oil to our country. And what I wonder about is if you look at the fact that someone else controls the price and the supply, and then take into consideration that we're sending $600 billion, that's what they're saying, overseas, and about 60% of that's being picked up by OPEC nations. And if you look at our national debt that's growing, it'll be over $10 trillion. And since 2001, it's gone up 40% or more, and 70% of it's being purchased by the Japanese, the Chinese, and the OPEC nations. And one of the things that's of concern to me is that this all has some national security implications. If somebody controls the cost of something that's very valuable or can control the supply of it, and they're also at the same time buying your debt, and if you're in the business world, you're probably going to put that company out of business. I know it's a little more complicated than that, but I don't think the national security part of this has been given enough priority in terms of our considerations. I've talked about, for years, I've been on the Department of Public Works Committee, and I keep talking about harmonizing our energy, our environment, our economy, and our national security. And for some reason, we aren't able to do that. And that's part of the problem why we can get legislation passed. So I'd be interested in, is this dimension something that's of concern to any of you, or am I just exaggerating it? And I'm talking about more, less energy, conservation, all the things you're talking about. But I think there seems to be more of an urgency here than we're giving.
Mr. Chairman, can I take a moment on this? First of all, let me say that the first time I appeared here, Scoop Jackson, this was his major point about the connection between energy and national security. And I couldn't agree with you more about the severity of it and its increasingly strong connection. And again, my colleague, Jim Schlesinger and I have been talking about this, and it is influencing our foreign policy and our freedom of action to pursue our other foreign policy objectives around the world. It is a major concern, and the issue is we can't do away with it because we are dependent and our allies are dependent. It's something that has to be managed, and it has to be managed more carefully and more consistently.
I would add to that we talk about the economic cost of high oil prices. There's certainly, as you're suggesting, a geopolitical cost, and that cost is also quite high. Look at what's happening in Latin America in terms of the shift. Look at the shift. It's about $500 billion a year that we're spending on oil imports, some of that going to Canada and so forth. But we're seeing altogether a shift of income of something like $2 trillion this year from the oil importers to the oil exporters. With that goes a lot of power. And I know Frank Verrastro mentioned the National Petroleum Council study, but $2 trillion is a big number, so it's worth keeping in mind. Frank headed the geopolitical part of the National Petroleum Council study, and I know that was a very big part of it that you wrestled with.
Yeah, if I just might add one thing. In the concept the world is changing, the G8, the developed world, in 1997 controlled 65% of global GDP. By 2007, it was 58%, and the projections are by 2015, it'll be 45%. So there's this emerging group of countries that will have more political weight, more leverage. Some are producing nations, some are consuming nations. The landscape is changing, and in that context, I think the rule is changing. I was also on Dr. Deutsch's study at the Council on Foreign Relations. This idea of integrating energy policy into foreign policy, trade policy, economic policy, environmental policy. We like to have these silos, but as a practical matter, energy as a strategic commodity is being played around the world. It has a lot more component pieces.
Next is Senator Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for organizing this, and thanks to the witnesses. We've been engaged in this effort that started as a gang of 10, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, that then grew to 16 and now 20, and we have other senators ready to sign up in the coming days. And we came together with the belief that it was urgently required that we act, and that we act in a comprehensive way, that we don't do just one thing, that we don't bet the farm on one technology or one approach, but that we be broad-based and that we look comprehensively. So our proposal focuses on renewables and conservation and efficiency and electric plug-in and geothermal and hydrogen and drilling offshore and nuclear and clean coal. Some of a lot of different things, with none of us knowing precisely what has the greatest bang for the buck over time, but a belief if we plant a lot of seeds, some of them will grow, and that we absolutely have to have an ability to transition to whatever future technologies might be available. Now, whether we have precisely the right goals or precisely the right numbers attached to them, I don't think any of us know. I think what we are confident of is that we have the only bipartisan, comprehensive approach, and that other plans that are now coming along in many cases closely track what we have proposed, but none of them have the comprehensive approach that we have suggested. I would just, in listening to each of you, it sounds to me like all of you are endorsing a comprehensive approach. Could I just ask each of the witnesses if that's the case, if that's what you are recommending to us?
Senator, I think it is. The question is the amount of balance, so there's relative pieces here. And the sequencing, I think, is important, too. Conservation and efficiency, easiest to do, need to get started now. Technology, broad array, and then keep in mind the time frames that it takes to get things. And you're preserving options for something else to come along.
I think,
Dr. Yergin?
yeah, I think the simple answer is yes. I think that's right. And I think you said it, is that we don't know what's going to actually have the biggest bang for the buck. We'll know a lot more in 5 years, but to get to 5 years, we've got to get going and we've got to be consistent.
If I could just interrupt before we go to the next. On the question of efficiency, I just had a meeting in Dickinson, North Dakota, which is in the middle of the oil patch, and I had a man come representing Fisher Industries. They just had done an external review of all their operations to improve efficiency. They had somebody come in and evaluate all of their engines. We're able to save 34%. Evaluate all of their lighting. We're able to save 50%. Some of that lighting was only 1 year old, but they chose to replace it because they could get such greater efficiency. So clearly, that has got to be part of what we do. One of the things our group is now looking at is building codes, because we've seen the very successful California effort and how dramatically their success was in savings there.
If I can say that one thing in terms of the balance that can have an impact, which you've just addressed, is getting efficiency so it's not at the tail end, but that it's not something you can look at and say this is efficiency, but when you add it up, it is a thing, and to get it into that big piece at the top.
Yeah, and I would echo that. And it's more than language. I think the better term is efficiency than conservation. Conservation is doing less with less. It's turning down the lights, putting on a sweater, sitting in the dark, whatever. Efficiency is doing more with less. It's greater productivity that we can get out of our economy. The company you're referring to, they're going to do well. They're going to even do better. They've cut their costs. They're going to produce more. So language really matters in this regard, and I would urge you to think in those terms. The other thing please don't forget is the low-income community. The people who really take it on the chin are people who are facing high oil and gas prices, who have to heat homes, buy electricity. You and I spend 1 or 2 or 3% of our take-home income on energy. They can spend 15, 20, 30%. We have unfortunately neglected the home weatherization program. We've done 5 or 6 million homes. There are 28, in 30 years, there are 28 million eligible homes. We have put money into LIHEAP, but LIHEAP is a one-shot buy-down of energy bills, whereas weatherization goes in, fixes people's homes, and the returns are over 10, 20, 30 years. We shouldn't be doing 100,000 homes a year. We should be doing 1 million homes a year for the next 10 years and at least get to a half or third of the eligible families.
Well, you'll be pleased to know we have $2 billion in this plan for weatherization. Professor Deutsch?
Okay, well, could you shorten your responses so we can get a few more people here before we have the noon recess? Go ahead.
The energy policy doesn't only have to be comprehensive, it has to be sustained. And we've had problems both with keeping it sustained and with, and your Fisher example of efficiency in North Dakota points out the importance of best practice. And the government has not been good at having programs which has deployed best practice through the economy, especially to smaller companies and smaller businesses, which are usually less energy efficient. So getting best practice is very important.
So yes to the comprehensive question on the efficiency side. I mean, it's such an opportunity that when you talk about things in new energy sources that will create jobs, we have a new business around providing people with those efficiency ideas to large industrials and others. So it is a big opportunity. The shift in technology in the future is to move that to the front end of the equation and think about how to build something, not just how to make it more efficient after it's built.
If I could just make a concluding statement, we also have dedicated $5 billion for battery technology because almost every expert that's come before our group said that is a huge opportunity for the country.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for your comments, your insights this morning. Hard to believe that it was just a couple months ago that we had a similar panel and we're sitting at $145 a barrel, and today it's $100. Some would suggest, oh, the pressure is off. I can tell you at home in Alaska, the pressure is not off. We just had an energy hearing in the regional community of Bethel, and the discussion about what folks are paying, whether it's at the pump, it's $6 a gallon at the pump. Home heating fuel is anywhere between $7 and $10 a gallon. Food prices are absolutely astronomical, $10 for a gallon of milk if you can get it. Doesn't make a difference the fact that we've gone down $47 in the past couple of months per barrel. The pain to the American public is there. I want to ask a question about just the consistency and the predictability in our policies. And I would suggest from the get-go that there is not a lot of consistency, unfortunately, or predictability for the industry, and therein lies a part of the problem. We have we do have to have solutions that are not either or. We do have to have a comprehensive approach if we're going to advance a reasonable energy policy. We're struggling now as we wrap up this session with how we extend the tax credits for whether it's wind or some of the other renewables that are out there. But in the meantime, you've got an industry that says, are we on or are we off? What do we do? How do we invest? There are some who are suggesting that if we should open up ANWR for drilling, if we do open up more areas offshore, that in fact what will happen is the message then is that we're not really serious about the renewables and the alternatives because we can't get these tax credit extensions for more than a couple years. And then we send the signal that, well, it's more of a focus on drilling. How do we get out of this kind of fickle policy as it relates to the signals that are sent? you're all saying that we need all of the above. We need to do more domestic production. We need to encourage that and enhance it. We need to go down the track of the next generation of energy, which is our alternatives and renewables. But our policies are not helping the picture right now. What suggestions do you have? Professor, you're smiling like, well, that's an obvious. Go ahead.
It sounds to me like all 20 senators who are here have exactly the same view of this that you just expressed, that you got to do all the above. So, Frank, sorry? Right, I'm sorry, right. So I'm saying if you all say that we've got to do all the above and it's all connected, there's not one piece of it that can go without the other, it doesn't make any sense. It should happen. I mean, why isn't it happening? That's what, I mean, because I couldn't agree with you more. You can't do this by selecting one thing, and I think it's quite I'm impressed that everybody here sees that it's all these things have to happen together.
Are any of you concerned that by doing more domestically when it comes to increased production, that somehow or other we're taking the ball off of advancing renewables and alternatives?
I do think it's important to send the right signals. So I don't think they need to be incompatible by any respect. And I do think it's exactly the way the message needs to be communicated, is that we need both. And on the renewable and alternative side, I think a more comprehensive program that allows for the kind of support those programs need early on in life, but have an understanding as to how then that would go away over time as you expect those technologies to develop. But a longer term picture would be part of that answer.
I've been writing a new book looking at the last 20, 30 years of energy policy, and when you stand back and look at it, you really do see it's quite surprising how much it will change over a 3-4 year period in terms of commitment, non-commitment, stop and go. I think it sure seems to me that renewables need to address the production tax credit, but have an awful lot of momentum, public support, venture capital money. It's a different environment for renewables than it was even 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So I don't think there's a sense that they're going to be lost in the mix. And the question is how to get them from being very small to start to being a significant part of the mix.
I do think that the on-again, off-again approach we've taken to incentives for renewables has been a big, big problem. Major investors come to the table but pull back because you get a 1 or 2 year extension. We've got to address that. It may not be that the tax code is the right place to be doing this. Other countries do it in different ways. Feed-in tariffs are used across Europe. If we have revenues from selling carbon credits, that may be another way to do it. The tax code that's so dependent upon appropriations to find an offset, that's a problematic way to be helping an industry get going. But I do disagree some with Dan. The renewable energy industry is in a very immature state. It does need the support. Traditional industry does enjoy much more permanent subsidies. If you look at nuclear liability insurance, it's 20 or 30 year authorization. If you look at the oil and gas industry, many of the subsidies there are in fact long-term or permanent. This 1 or 2 year on-again, off-again support we give to these emerging technologies just won't work.
Okay, we've got, let's see here.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask if we could extend this to 10 minutes after the hour so we can all get our questions in?
I'm glad to see it extended till 10 after the hour. I may not be able to stay for the full time, and we do have another panel starting at 1. So we will just proceed. If people could keep their questions short and their answers short, that will help. The lineup I've got still here is in the order that people arrived: Klobuchar, Whitehouse, Salazar, Akaka, Landrieu, Lincoln. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. I'm one of the gang of 20. As a former prosecutor, it was hard to join, but I did. I had our sign that Senator Conrad rejected of E, energy. But I had a question, and the reason it interested me, this proposal and the work that's being done, is I thought there was a reasonable approach to look at high potential for domestic production in certain areas, but also the thing that really interested me, that it was a bipartisan effort to try to extend the production tax credits. And I would agree with you, Dr. Yergin, it's been this game of red light, green light, on again, off again, and there's actual studies showing how 8 months before it goes off, the investment lags. But the other thing that interested me was just the focus on the technology and trying to push that with cars and trucks. And I thought you put it best, Mr. Verastro, when you talked about, and it's simply that I'm going to use, that a 50% increase in efficiency turns $4 a gallon gas into $2 a gallon gas. And my question is, maybe Mr. Reicher, Mr. Dr. Yergin would be about where that technology really is, because I've heard that maybe we have the technology, but it's a few years out, or we're going to have to buy it from other countries, or it's too expensive.
So let me quickly say, we built a fleet of plug-in hybrid vehicles at Google. We converted Toyota Priuses and Ford Escapes, and our employees are driving them. We hired professional drivers to go and test them. The Ford Escapes are getting 50 miles per gallon. The Toyota Priuses, plug-in Toyota Priuses, are getting 90 miles per gallon. We know how to build these cars. I do admit battery technology has some distance to go. The good news is you have big automobile manufacturers from General Motors to Toyota stepping up and planning to build these. So this is near-term technology. No doubt we've got to continue to improve some things inside. But unlike, for example, a major move to hydrogen, for example, this is here today. So it does, though, require some government support. I do think incentives, like we've provided for non-plug-in hybrids, provided for plug-ins, would be very useful. Continued R&D funding, federal procurement for the U.S. fleet, all those things would help. But it's near.
And the idea here is to shift some of the resources and the incentives we've been giving to oil, and to put some of those incentives into R&D.
R&D and commercialization incentives. Agreed.
Mm-hmm. One question on cellulosic ethanol. Minnesota is obviously, like South Dakota, as Senator Thune was explaining, has been one of the major areas for ethanol. We have, I think, 400 of the 1,200 pumps or 1,600 pumps that there are, and we know how difficult it is, this chicken-egg possibility that we produce, but then there may not be enough vehicles that are flex fuel, and then there may not be enough places to get it. And so that's why this idea of developing these cars and trucks that are not only hybrids but also are flex fuel, have the ability to go to flex fuel interests me, and also obviously going to the cellulosic ethanol, the next step with switchgrass and prairie grass and algae and whatever we can do. And my question is, right now we're on E85, but there's some talk of looking at more blends, going up from E10 to E20, and that would be a way of doing this that would be more mainstream. Does anyone want to address that? Professor Deutsch.
I think these are very, very important steps for the country to take. You can go to E80 without E20, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way, E20 without any problem. Cellulosic ethanol has a tremendous possibility in this country, and it should be pursued as rapidly as possible.
All right. Thank you very much.
Senator Whitehouse is next, and Senator Salazar, you're after that. Maybe if you could preside for the balance of this panel, that would be helpful. And then after you, Senator Akaka, Senator Landrieu, and Senator Lincoln, as long as the witnesses are able to stay and people still have questions. But Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Yes, sir.
Would you just yield a moment?
Of course I would.
Senator Bingaman, I wonder on our way out, we're going to start up again at 1. Is that the plan?
That's the plan.
And I will try to be here, and so we can start it together. If you would permit me, as we plan to leave here, to make one observation for the record. I really am pleased to hear the panel, which is very divergent in many respects as to where they come from and where their interests have evolved. To lay almost to rest the idea, America, let me put a premise before us. However we are going to go about diminishing our use of automobiles that use derivatives from crude oil as their source of energy, however we're going to do that, it seems to be the testimony that we're going to have to use crude oil for a long time, almost indefinitely, and a lot of it, and that we shouldn't let our supply fall from where it is now. We ought to try to keep it up. And I have been amazed Mr. Chairman, at how many people have confused using American crude oil for this long-term bridge, confused that with, and you shouldn't be using crude oil because you're trying to solve the problem of greenhouse gases. I mean, there is no question we're going to use automobiles, and in doing that, we're going to use our own crude oil or we're going to use somebody else's. And I think we finally got that most people understand it, but there seem to be some policymakers who just seem to say we shouldn't bring any more oil on board because we don't want to be using it, while you all seem to be telling us we're going to use it. And I think that's a very important thing that we finally have arrived at, Mr. Chairman. Maybe there are some still left that don't want to produce American oil, but I think we're getting there little by little, and we've almost arrived at the time when most policymakers would concur. And I think you've been part of leading us, and I have, and I'm glad we're there. I think it's desperately important that we understand that issue. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Bingaman. Gentlemen, we're in the middle of a near total mortgage system meltdown in this country. We have a health care system that burns 16% of our GDP, in which the Medicare liability alone has been estimated at $34 trillion. We're burning $10 billion a month in Iraq. This administration has run up $7.7 trillion in national debt by our calculation, and there is worsening evidence every day of global warming with worsening environmental, national security, and economic ramifications. In the light of those conditions, do any of you seriously contend that drilling for more oil is the #1 issue facing the American people today? No, it doesn't seem so. If we're going to deal with conservation, which strikes me as where most of the lowest hanging fruit and the highest return investment exists at this point, particularly immediately, we are looking for as practical suggestions as we can get into this legislation as it moves forward. I've heard you talk about weatherization. I could not agree more. And I think electric vehicles presents another huge opportunity. Are there other, even potentially smaller and more technical areas where you think that there's room for what I might call, a quick fix or something that isn't too heavy a lift that will make things right? One example that comes to mind is that in the commercial real estate industry, very often the lease makes the operator entirely immune from energy cost in big malls and things like that. And there may be a way to solve a specific technical problem like that. Could you give us a list of what you think are the best quick, even if they're not big things, little things add up. What are the best smart quick fixes that you can think of, even if they're not very big ones?
Very quickly, more aggressive approach to appliance standards. Again, very boring, but if we could make our refrigerators...
Hey, boring can work.
Pardon?
Boring can work.
And boring can work. Boring has worked significantly, so that's #1. I do think building codes, there's just extraordinary things you can do with that. And the third thing I'd say is using information technology to better monitor and manage our energy use. And you are seeing the emergence of that from all sorts of companies. And I think that's going to be very interesting. And if the federal government, in its own procurement, in its own buildings, its own operations, took much more of a lead than it is today, 500,000 buildings, 500,000 federal vehicles, that could be 2% of all U.S. energy use. It could be a great laboratory.
Professor Deutsch had his hand up also, and if you could touch briefly before you go on whether the metering in homes is something we should look at to two-way time of use and so forth. The meter in my house is a pretty antiquated piece of technology compared to almost any other piece of technology, and it seems to be holding back the IT development. But Professor Deutsch, let me ask you first.
Well, the word quick sort of startled me because I think one important area is batteries for storage. I mean, that really is an important point, but it may not be quick. I do recall that at one time the United States had a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit. That would give you immediate, enormous gains. I don't know how that would go down with the American people, but I will tell you that it would.
Been on an American highway recently?
But I will tell you that would have an enormous payoff. And with respect to smart metering in homes, I think that that's coming, and it will have tremendous effects. And it's certainly one of the things that Mr. Riker has proposed. It, again, will not come quickly, but it is extremely important and will have effects.
One quick thing that might make a difference, and I don't know what the status of the funding and support for it is, but within the Department of Energy is the demonstration, the groups that can work with small and medium-sized businesses to simply teach and communicate with them. And I suspect those are one of the things that the funding goes up and down for, and mostly down.
My time has expired. I thank the acting chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse. Let me ask a couple of questions, and then I think there's 4 or 5 other people that still want to ask questions. So with the patience of the panel, Senator Okaka will chair the hearing after I leave, because I have to leave in just a second. Let me say first, I think that what we have seen from all of you as a panel, and I thank you for your testimony here today, is that there is an agreement on a lot of what it is that we have to do. The question is whether or not there is a willingness and the political courage to do what it is that you as experts would ask us to all do. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do with our gang of 20 or 24 now that is trying to pull together a comprehensive energy package. It is not a stop and go, but it's comprehensive and sustainable over a long period of time. I have a couple of questions to ask of you, and let me just ask this one of Dr. Yergin and Professor Deutsch, and that is with respect to coal. We talk about hybrid plug. We talk conservation. We agree on that. We talk about some of the new technologies like hybrids and hybrid plug-ins as things that are no-brainers that we ought to move forward with. Well, the question is, I think Mr. Riker raised, has to do with where's the electricity going to come from for these new national vehicle fleets that we're going to create. Nuclear, coal, those are possibilities. My question is about coal, because I think we have the kinds of coal resources where we are, coal is to us what oil is to Saudi Arabia. Our problem is that when you put the triangle together that I think you were describing, Mr. Verrastro, we have the carbon problem that comes with the burning of coal. And yet, in the 2005 Act, we said we're going to move forward with carbon capture and sequestration and trying to develop clean coal technologies. And yet I don't see, frankly, much of that happening. We don't have a single demonstration project of any significance going on around the country. So is there a role for us to try to include a carbon capture and sequestration clean coal technology in a very major way as we move forward with energy policy?
I think that's really a question. Professor Deutsch just finished this big study at MIT and thought a lot about it. So,
okay, Professor Deutsch.
Bluntly put, there is no solution to our energy future without using coal. And if you're going to use coal in a responsible way, we have to do carbon capture and sequestration.
Okay, so
and we are woefully behind.
Okay, so let's agree on that point then, Professor Deutsch, and then let's say, what is it then that we as a United States Senate should do?
Well, I believe that the program which is in place now for sequestration demonstrations in the Department of Energy is too small both in terms of size of projects. The scope of each project is woefully inadequate in terms of monitoring, verification, and site selection. The process for setting a regulatory framework where you as a citizen and I as a citizen will be happy to have this CO2 sequestered in saline aquifer has not begun to take place. So we are way behind in this.
The essence, Dr. Deutsch, I think, is that, and I frankly, too, and I share this with Senator Bingaman and Senator Domenici, have been disappointed with the fact that we have not moved forward with the Department of Energy in that way, in a more robust way to try to deal with clean coal technologies and carbon sequestration. Let me ask you another question because of the shortness of time here, and that is with respect to oil shale. And I heard you, Mr. Verrastro, talk about oil shale and tar sands as being very much a part of our comprehensive energy program. In the 2005 Act, we did adopt an oil shale research and development program, which is underway. We have, in my state, where 80% of the oil shale is located, oil shale reserves. We have 6 pilot projects that are underway and a lot of research and development in situ processes that are moving forward, but still many unanswered questions. How much energy is it going to take to heat up the shale, to take the kerogen out of the shale? How much water is it going to take to do all of that? Just from your point of view, I would imagine you are familiar with the regulatory program that we have in place with the research and development and leasing program. Is that an adequate program for us to move forward with the development of oil shale? When I start with Mr. Roster with you.
Senator, I think you put two other pieces together. The climate change piece to me is the game changer. I'm going to get to oil shale in a second, but one of the things that's happening now that you're going to see next spring, we've stopped the development of at least 30 coal-fired power plants that I'm aware of because of either uncertainty or increased cost or regulatory burdens. We can't scale up nuclear in time. Renewables have a great piece, but we have to solve the intermittency problem. The near-term fix, if demand stays high, is that compressors, we're going to go to gas. So while we have increased domestic production of gas, we're going to use a lot more of it than we think we are. And if the price goes up, people are going to see in their electricity bills the increased price of gas, just like we saw with oil. On the issue of shale, after I left the government, I worked with Tosco before I went to Pennzoil, so I'm familiar with shale in Colorado. There's a couple of different kinds of shale, and technology has really moved. So the difference between the Green River Basin and the Bakken, for example, is that with horizontal technology now, you can actually go in, if the rock is permeable and porous, and push the oil through and produce it as liquid conventional fuel. In Colorado, if you have to mine it and retort it, there are other problems, but technology is moving. And actually, Shell has a project where they actually heat the subsurface for several years, but heat it up so that you can move it in a liquid state. I think the technology funding has to go forward, but it's a question of priorities and timing. So as we go forward, this whole climate change debate has to be rolled into the security debate.
Any other comments? Let me just thank all of you, and Senator Akaka, it's your turn for questions and also your turn for chairing the summit.
Thank you very much, Senator Salazar. Let me say thank you to the panel, an elite group of experts in energy. Many of my questions have been answered. Just one that has been on my mind, and I'm looking for the best way, and this has to do with policy, the best way to incorporate carbon reduction policies into our national energy policy to ensure consistency. And we haven't been consistent. There's no question about that, and you revealed that. But my question, what is the best way to do that, to incorporate carbon reduction policies with our energy independence and cost and reliability objectives?
I think the single most important thing we could do is to set a significant charge for carbon emission from all fossil fuel uses in transportation, electricity, and elsewhere. There are two ways of doing that, a cap and trade system or a carbon charge directly. I would be happy with either one. I think that's a question about what goes down better. I think there are reasons to prefer a direct carbon charge with recycling of that money to the economy. But that's the single most important thing we could do. And incidentally, it would permit you to get rid of a lot of other regulations. Because once you have a carbon charge in, some of these other incentives that we reach for would be redundant.
And Senator, I would just add that just from a jurisdictional standpoint, one of the challenges you face is the Environment and Public Works has authority over that kind of regulation, and Senate Energy deals on the energy side of this equation. I think we've really got to take a more integrated approach to how we're going to deal with this mix of energy, environmental, economic, and security problems, as you've heard from the panel. And setting a price on carbon is not going to be adequate. These energy fixes we're talking about are not going to be adequate in and of themselves. We need to do both. And from a political standpoint, these need to be integrated analytically and beyond.
Thank you. Senator Landrieu.
Thank you all very much. And I want to really, again, just say how pleased I am with the outcome of this summit. I was one of the ones that encouraged the summit to take place, and as a member of a group that's been working for now several months, and our group has grown from an initial 10 to now 20, and as Senator Conrad and Senator Chambliss, who have given extraordinary leadership to this group, we have many more senators very interested in our comprehensive approach. Let me ask the question. Senator Whitehouse, who is a very experienced prosecutor, deftly crafted his question to get a non-answer from you all, but let me try to ask it this way. Again, you've stated this, I believe, several times, but I did hear you say that more domestic production is essential to this challenge before us. Is that correct or not correct?
First, let me say that down here at this corner of the table, we had the strong sense that we hadn't quite come to grips with that question, and now you explain why we couldn't do it. We were sort
He
of
is
saying,
very crafty.
we sort of were saying, what happened here? How did we miss that? I think that we're all saying, well, I don't want to speak for everybody, but my sense is that we're all saying that it goes back to either or, that domestic production is certainly part of the picture. And if you look at the U.S. energy balance, domestic, I mean, where else is it? I mean, we're going to have alternatives, renewables. They're small, they're growing, great potential for technological change. Big conservation has a lot to offer. And then there's conventional energy, which is where most of our energy comes from.
And Mr. Riker, let me ask you, because a group of Democrats, and I am one of them, but there's a group to the left, way to the left, that really appreciates your focus on this. So I want to ask you this question. Do you believe that more domestic production is a part of this equation?
We clearly are getting most of our energy today from traditional sources, and I expect that will be the case for some number of years into the future. So do we need to be producing more natural gas in a responsible way domestically? Yeah, I think that's something we need to be doing.
Do you think we have to produce more oil domestically, at least for the next 5 or 10 years?
I think, we have a limited domestic supply of reasonably obtainable, economically obtainable oil. So I just think I think the risk that we run here is that we overstate what we can do domestically in terms of our oil supply. And what results from that is we take our attention away from real options that we've, I think, all stressed, which is what can you do with efficiency on the front end to lower demand? What can you do in terms of vehicle technologies?
Professor Deutsch,
let me just add one more thing. I do think that there are baseload renewable resources, both, I mentioned geothermal being one of the major ones, and I do think biofuels offer a significant opportunity. So I just want to be sure that as we push for more domestic oil production, let's be realistic about what we really can increase, and let's make sure that we don't, in the process, take our eyes off some of these probably more significant opportunities that we have.
Well, I think that you've heard from the group of us that that's what we're trying to accomplish, is a balance between pushing for more domestic reserves of oil and gas as we push for these other efficiencies that you have so eloquently spoken about. But Professor Deutsch, would you please comment on this limited domestic endowment issue? Because I really take issue with the charge that we hear around here that there's just not enough oil and gas anywhere to do any good. And I point to the Gulf of Mexico, which I'm familiar with, as you might imagine, representing the state of Louisiana, that in 1982, the estimates from MMS were that there were like 3 billion barrels of recoverable oil in the Gulf. We've been drilling for 20 years since, and today that estimate has now gone up to 30 billion barrels of recoverable oil. So would one or you or any of you comment on, is it true, or have I been misled, that technology is enabling us to find more domestic sources than we thought we had before, of both oil and gas?
Senator, I think it's clear that over time, we've been using up our conventional oil and gas in the lower 48 in the Gulf and even in Alaska. And as we use up the conventional oil and gas low-cost production, we have to go to higher-cost methods to either find new oil or get more oil in place out. So the trend is always, there is obviously more oil and more gas reserves in the United States and off its coast. So you have plenty of oil there if you're willing to pay the costs of getting it done. But I want to underline that doing something to increase U.S. production of natural gas and of oil is a integral part of a comprehensive approach to our energy future. You
Dr.
cannot
Rubin.
do it by ignoring it or walking around it. And especially, it is impossible to go to countries in the Persian Gulf and say, you must increase your production if they don't see the United States making some effort to keep up its production. So I want to be clear that something has to be done to improve our production of oil and gas in the U.S.
Dr. Yergin?
Yeah, I think that point that we are asking other people to increase their production, and Frank mentioned the numbers, the growth in world demand, but we don't necessarily want to be part of it. I think when you look at the history of it, you see there's always this pessimism, and technology changes. It changes on the alternatives and renewables. It also changes in terms of production of oil and gas. And discoveries are made, and then it turns out that the ultimate recoverable reserves are much greater because you learn more about the field. So, so that the kind of estimates that are there now for other offshore areas, are very preliminary. I think the other thing that gets lost in this discussion, it goes back to something very important that Frank has said. If coal becomes more limited, nuclear doesn't happen with the speed that people might anticipate. That means we're basically going to burn more natural gas and electric generation. That's the course we're on. Well, when you explore offshore, you're not only exploring, as you know, for oil, you're also exploring for natural gas. So you're also exploring for keeping the lights on. And so, it's not only about what we're going to put in our cars, but it's also the electricity side of it. And I think that often gets lost in the discussion. And that's going to be a very important issue, and Frank mentioned what we might be looking at in terms of electricity.
Well, thank you. And as a pro-drilling Democrat, I couldn't think of a more positive note to end on. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank the panel very much for your valuable responses and your contribution today. And thank you. This panel is concluded.